Do you love the look of chiffon, satins, those silky type flowy fabrics, but don't know where to start and how to work with them? You could make amazing things like this. They don't have to be that simple either. And in today's video, I'm giving you more than 20 tips of how to work with difficult fabrics. So it'll be very practical. Keep watching.
Time flashed by and I woke up on the other side of the moon.
Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing, limitless sewing. This video has been prepared with a lot of love for you all, and because I've had so many requests over time, I'm always sharing with you projects that I make out of slippery fabrics, really nice flowy, probably the nicest fabrics, you know, chiffon, lightweight crepes, silks, that sort of thing. And they do take a little bit extra care to work with, although when the time passes and you've had these in your hands and you've been working with them, you start to get the feel of it and it just starts becoming easier and easier. At the beginning of last year, 2019, I wrote a guest blog post for Love Notions, and it was all about how to work with silky type fabrics. You know, I really thought that out, all the tips that are there, and I made 3 Rhapsody blouses in that occasion. I've always been directing the people that ask me how I work with these fabrics to that blog post. And I thought I would like to extend all the information that is there and just create a video about it. You can actually have the visual. And I have piled over 20 tips to share with you about how to work with these types of fabrics. By these types of fabrics, I mean chiffons, georgettes, crepes, lightweight crepes. Some rayons can be terribly slippery, satins, silks, any fabric that you just get and it's extremely flowy and beautiful, and you know that any garment you make with it is just going to look amazing, but it's not like cutting a cotton or a linen where the fabric doesn't move around. So there are some precautions that need to be taken. I want to share with you the best practices or the best advice. If you've been watching how I sew over time, you might see in older videos or in recent videos that I don't do everything that I'm going to say in these tips. And I have to be honest, I've been working with chiffon for decades that I almost treat them as any other fabric. Almost. I still take important precautions, but not to the extreme. And all the tips here, I want to keep it simple in the style that is this channel, without using special tools or supplies and things like that, keeping it basic, keeping it simple. For most of the examples shown, I'm going to be using this to show you. It's a crinkle chiffon, very transparent, you can see me through it. And I've actually been working on a project you're going to see very soon where it's made out of this. So I thought I might as well film all these practical things for you. And the first have to do with actually how you are going to place your pattern pieces onto the fabric. And the first tip comes from the best recommended practice. So let's see what that is. You can see that I've got the pattern pieces extended. So the white area is the original pattern, and I put paper so that it's just one piece and I can avoid cutting on the fold. The fabric also is fully extended across the table, so nothing is hanging off, and this is the proper way to cut these types of fabric. Here you saw me cutting out the Melrose top from each to stitch. It's a very nice tropical chiffon, very light, very airy. And I actually did extend the pattern piece to have it double. I extended my fabric on top of the table. So I was cutting the 2 pattern pieces in a single layer. But basically these large pieces, I didn't want to be cutting them on the fold. It is a small type pattern and I was able to do that quite easily. And then I used the same method to cut this other Melrose top. That is this really silky satin, the flowiest fabric ever. And so, you know, when you can do that, I have done that as well with some of my Rhapsody blouses that I've made in the past. Fully extended the pieces, cut out piece by piece, you know, no rush. But then sometimes I do cut on the fold. And now it's not that you can't cut your patterns on the fold like you would with any other fabric, you can, but I have a few tips for that, and here are 3 more tips. And I have a tape measure. Okay, here you can see my fabric. I did extend it this way and fold it onto itself so I can cut a pattern piece there on the fold. If I'm not going to be doing it in a fully extended piece, which would be recommended, I do it like this, but I do something extra. So I folded it the width that I need for my pattern piece, and with my tape measure I just make sure that the fold is even so that I'm not folding it crooked. I do really want to fold this down the grain line. If you have any fabric left over, I don't want it to dangle off the table that way because it could create weight and make this shift. Same as the leftover there, I don't want it to hang off the table, so it's all crumpled up there so it's not creating any weight. You see, I have my fabric on top of a cutting mat, and for me it's super important to use a cutting mat when cutting chiffon because I like to fold my fabric there and actually tape it down along the line so that it's really straight and even. This is just regular tape, nothing special, it won't damage the fabric. It actually doesn't stay there very long, it'll start coming off very soon, so I have to cut soon. But this will make my fabric stay there without moving, right? So that's something I do, I put tape there to hold it in place. Now I'll just place my pattern piece there, and this is cut on the fold. That's why I made sure that the fold is really even and it's not going to move, and it's stuck down with tape. And I want the edge of the pattern to be on the edge of the fold of the fabric, of course, especially on this top part where the neckline is. I don't want it to be away, not even like 1/8 of an inch. I want it to be right there on the fold. This pattern does have a pleat to mark there, so this has to be super accurate. Of course, these tips are not conventional. No one's ever going to tell you to tape your fabric down onto the cutting mat, but I have done this time and time again, and it really works for me. The fabric does get placed really nicely on the grain line, and you're following the line of the cutting mat as well as the grain line on the fabric, measuring. You know, it can be super accurate if you do it this way. So 2 options: fully extend your pattern piece, put your whole fabric on a table. It does help if you have a huge table. In my case, my table is not that big, and that's why sometimes I do end up cutting on the fold. But with the precautions that you just saw, it can be done. Now we're going to see 6 more tips. These are all related to how you cut it, how you mark it, all those practical things that you do while you're actually cutting your pattern pieces. So let's hop into 6 more tips. I basically have pattern weights, if you will. I don't have actual pattern weights, I just use empty jars. I'm gonna place a pattern weight right there, a jar. So I have my pattern weights there. I use anything, my phone, the pin thing, anything that's gonna provide weight. I know that that edge on the fold is right on the fold of the chiffon. The chiffon is taped down to the mat, so it's not going to move. I have little pins, small and thin, and in good condition, sharp, in case I need to use them, but I'll be trying not to use them to cut out my pattern piece. And for this case, I am going to place a pin there, but I'm not going to place it like anywhere I want to. I want to place it right on the edge there so that it is within the seam allowance of what I'm actually going to sew there later, because you don't want to damage the fabric. So that's where that little pin is, right there. I do have pins along the neckline right on the edge because I really want them to be super accurate. About the pins, there are different size pins, and in the past I used to use humongous pins. Once I found little ones, I always buy the same ones and I use those for everything, and I think they're very appropriate for these types of fabric. I do replace them quite frequently and make sure that they're in good condition, that they're sharp. As soon as I see one go a little bit blunt, I throw it out immediately so that I know that I always have good pins for these projects. Because let's be honest, these types of fabrics are very heavily in rotation in my projects. It's not like I sew one of these types of projects every couple of months. You see them pretty frequently. I am sewing quite a lot of them, so I do want my pins to stay in great condition. I have a rotary cutter and I will be changing the blade to a brand new one so that I make sure it's super sharp. With my rotary cutter with a fresh blade, I'm just gonna go cut around there. These are pretty like straight and rounded shapes, so it should be okay. Having a stash of blades to change out for the rotary cutter is important. I don't use the rotary cutter for all the projects, and I actually like using a nice scissors when I cut out denim, linen, cotton, you know, those types of fabrics that are structured. I don't use the rotary cutter because I'm trying to protect my blades that I have. It's hard for me to get the blades, and I have found a place online to get them here, but they aren't alpha, they are generic. so they don't last very long. So I do reserve them only for these types of fabrics because I know cutting with a rotary cutter in this case is much more accurate, much more precise, and will prevent the fabric from wriggling around and, you know, distorting when you put your scissors and cut there. I try to avoid using scissors. Scissors, when you put the scissors underneath, it lifts the fabric and then you get wonky cuts. So for fabric like this, I try to avoid the scissors. I do use it in some areas, very small areas. I have another pattern piece from this pattern there. I've got that taped right there. I've done the same thing. There is going to be a half placket here. So this is one of the very few areas where I'll cut by scissors. If I go with a rotary cutter, I run the risk of cutting more. There. And with the scissors, I got right to the tip there. And now I can just do this long one with the rotary cutter. And I actually did stop about 3/8 of an inch before getting to that point there. And I've got my finger underneath and I'm just gonna cut this last bit 3/8 of an inch. Okay, and I'm more confident that this is super accurate because I actually did that little part with the scissors. You saw that certain areas I do cut with scissors. Square areas where there's corners, maybe some darts that have been trued and have those angled shapes, I will cut those areas with the scissors, but just those areas, trying to prioritize the rotary cutter in all cases. After cutting this really carefully, I'm just going to take this pin out, and I have the markings here on this side, but there is a little pleat to mark, and I'm just going to use a pencil. If this were a notch, I wouldn't be cutting into the fabric. I would be marking. You can see the yellow mark there, and I can actually take this out of the tape there so I can mark the other side. And it's so see-through, I can actually see through the fabric. Up further on the shoulders, there's a couple notches there, a double notch, and I'm also just marking them. I do this for everything, whatever fabric it is. I will never ever cut a notch with the scissors. I just don't believe in damaging fabric that way. There you can clearly see the double notch there on that side and on that side. About marking anything on the pattern, notches, darts, whatever, you know, do it with care. Notches that are meant to be cut into the fabric, I will never do that. And this tip is not only applied for this fabric, for any fabric. I don't like damaging fabric that way, but in this case, these fabrics tend to unravel a lot and are delicate, and why would you want to ruin that area of your seam allowance with a big old cut there? Just mark it, it's much better. Now I'm just going to get rid of all these gadgets and take this pattern piece off the fabric. Just untape this from the cutting mat. And this won't damage your fabric, it's not going to harm it, you know, it's already coming off anyway. The adhesiveness of this is very low, you know, so don't worry. So that's off. And now I'm pretty sure I cut this really well on the grain line. The center back is really straight. If I hadn't have fixed this down, this could have been sliding like that while I was cutting, and then I get a really wonky piece. So I'm very happy that this is cut accurately. And now I'm gently just going to fold it there. Don't touch that neckline, just leave it. The neckline is right there, and put it aside, and then cut my other piece. I won't be holding this up to see how it looks on my body, like nothing like that. Just put it aside until it's time to sew without touching it. I'm very simple and practical. As I mentioned in my sewing, I'm not gonna go and like buy pattern weights or have pattern weights, proper pattern weights. It's just not something I'm interested in. And jars, we eat jam, olives, whatever. I have a ton of jars always. I just put a ton of jars on top, and other items I have on hand, even my phone, you know, anything that's gonna give me weight, I'll just put it on there. I'm very basic in that sense. And I think for these fabrics, just avoiding the pins. You can use them a little bit, but just the pattern weights are better in this case. Okay, so we've cut out the project. We have pattern pieces there in our lovely fabrics in a little pile there. So what do we need now to actually get sewing? I have 5 more tips that have all to do with how to actually sew these fabrics. I have 3 types of needles that could work for sewing this type of fabric. These 2 are universal needles and they are quite small. This one's 75, this one's 80. I would prefer this one, but if I didn't have this, I have sewn before with 80 and it's okay, but this is the biggest needle I would be happy to use in this type of fabric. Better than universal needles are Microtex needles. These are just sharper and they're just special for silk, polyester type fabric like chiffon. It's perfect. And this is 80. So I think that's appropriate too. But just because I have a smaller one for this one, I'm going to use that one. But any of these would work. 75, 80, either universal or microtex. If I had a smaller microtex, I might sew with that one. But just because I have that one, I'll use that one. A fresh new needle for a fresh new chiffon project. Using a smaller and sharp new needle makes total sense for these types of fabrics. You don't want to just use your standard jean needle like 100 on these types of fabrics. You know, I have never had a needle smaller than 75. I know there are smaller needles than that. I've never seen one, I've never had one, so 75, 80 is a nice size for me. I like those. Polyester thread seems to be finer than cotton threads, so that's why I prefer using polyester thread when I'm using chiffon or just lightweight fabrics. And this is a brand I buy here, Coat Streamer. It's made in Brazil. It says 100% polyester. This is the same, only I've already used it and I always remove those stickers. They really annoy me. I also buy these big cones of thread. It's cheaper to buy them in, you know, large amounts. And inside there's a sticker and it says 100% polyester. I always buy the same brand here locally and they turn out really well, good quality. Thread, you know, you could use cotton thread if it was really fine. But actually the cotton threads that I have, I look at them and they look super thicker than the polyester ones. And if you're working with fine fabrics, you don't want to be sewing with this thick old cotton thread. So that is the main reason. Polyester thread tends to be stronger as well. I have my machine with the new needle and the correct type of thread. I usually use 3. That is my preferred. I know a lot of people like sewing with smaller stitch lengths regularly, so maybe that would be the normal for you. For me, this is a short stitch length, so 2.4, 2.6 is what I would use with this type of fabric, just delicate fabric. If you're using a finer needle and finer thread, it is obvious that the stitch length needs to be shorter, so that is the reason. Basically, it's because of these choices of the needle, the thread and the fabric that make a shorter stitch a better option. Combination of sewing with a smaller needle and a thin thread will make a short stitch length make total sense. Personal preference, I tend to like 3 as a standard. I know a lot of people use like 2.5 as a standard. It's up to you, but whatever you're comfortable with for your other fabrics, just make it shorter for these. I have a scrap of the fabric here. You can see how see-through it is. I like to play around a little bit and see if I like how the stitch looks or if the tension is good. I like to practice a little bit on scraps with any project really. Maybe you can see the stitch, but the tension looks nice. It's not puckering or anything, so I don't need to adjust that. And the stitch length looks good. So I'm quite happy to sew my seams with this. Practicing is so important. You always have a scrap to practice on. Even myself, and I cut till the very end of the fabrics. I use minimal fabrics. There is always a piece that you can practice on before you actually start sewing your garment to make sure that you're happy with everything. The tension, your needle, the type of thread, how it's looking, just make sure. And now let's pretend this is a regular seam that I'm gonna sew. One big no-no for these types of fabrics is to backstitch. So go back and forth. It'll be super horrible, especially if you're starting on the edge. If you try to backstitch, look what's gonna happen. See how the fabric goes in like that? And it just creates this super horrible bulk, and sometimes the fabric can even rip there. Backstitching actually to be avoided. Just start sewing, leave the long threads there, and then these can be knotted by hand. You can thread one of these, pull it to the back, do whatever you want to secure it by hand, and it'll keep the smoothness there. The no backstitching thing is so important, and also it has to do with how the item's gonna look with the bulk there. You know, just leaving that thread and securing it by hand is gonna take you a few seconds extra, but it's gonna give you such a better result. French seams are ideal. If the pattern has 1/2 inch seam allowance, you would put them wrong sides together and do the first go at 1/4 inch. I try to put my pins vertical within that seam allowance, so it's smaller than 1/4 inch, and I just take it slow and sew this first go at the French seams. Once that's done, I do trim that and cut it down to about 1/8 of an inch so it doesn't create bulk inside. In this specific one, I'm sewing on a dolman type sleeve, so there is a curve there, and I will go ahead and do little tiny snips in there to allow this area to fold in nicely. It is a curved seam, and if you don't snip, you might have puckers down there. Then you fold this again, right sides together, a line there at the edge, and now I pin right on the edge, you can see there, so that it's really accurate. And then I sew again with 1/4 of an inch. Using my press-to-fold, I get a really nice result. And you know, 1/4 of an inch plus 1/4 of an inch equals the 1/2 an inch seam allowance that this pattern has. Some patterns have different seam allowances, so you can change the distances that you do with the 2 steps, but the result is always beautiful, very neat, it protects and it won't fray. Very nice. Okay, here I have a fake seam with a serged edge, and it looks nice. It's nice and neat. I think the serger is okay for this fabric. I have worked with more delicate fabrics where it wouldn't be okay. It would just like tear it apart, and it's just not good. In that case, I would use French seams and just do everything on the sewing machine. But it's just about testing and trying and seeing what works. Lots of options. It's good to have options, not just think automatically that these types need French seams. They are nice, you can do them if you want to, but sometimes you don't actually need to do them. Now I have 6 more tips that are a bit more specific and have got to do with sewing techniques in general that are super related to these fabrics that will make the garment just turn out better. Before actually cutting the shape, I fuse the interfacing onto the fabric so that it doesn't shrink or distort in shape or anything. I think the sewing of the neckline has to be really precise, and I prefer doing that. This fabric will shift everywhere. Look how thin it is. I have my main fabric already fused with the interfacing, it's black there, and this will not only stabilize this collar, it will also just take the sheenness away from it, and I don't want a sheen collar, of course. And then I'm just going to go and place this on top accurately and then cut it, and then I'll be confident that this hasn't changed shape. Block fusing facings, collar pieces, so important, and not just for these fabrics, for everything. When you apply heat to fusible interfacing to the fabric that you're fusing it on, there's a risk of it deforming, going out of shape, going smaller. You end up with a smaller facing that doesn't fit your neckline or whatever you're doing, same as your collar pieces. So block fusing is so important, and this is a dress I made, a batik dress, and you can see that there's a facing in there. So this facing has interfacing there, and that was block fused. I got my chiffon, saw how much fabric I needed to cut out that facing piece, fused the interfacing, had a piece of fabric already fused, and then cut out my facing piece there. This is a Montana shirt from Itch to Stitch. This is a full-blown shirt with a collar stand and a collar and a button placket, you know, a yoke, everything. One of the collar stands and one of the collar pieces is interfaced here, and I also block fused those. Super important. I do this with everything, but in this case I think it's super extra important. If you went and cut out a collar stand out of plain chiffon, cut out an interfacing piece separately and tried to fuse them together, your chiffon is already deformed by then. It's gone out of shape, you know. You want to keep them accurate because these pieces in garments need to fit together and be super accurate. So block fusing is so important. Any project that you use that with, you're gonna have a much better result where the notches are gonna match and you're just gonna have better accuracy. An option to using interfacing on a collar is to use the same type of fabric instead. An expensive route would be silk organza, but I'm just using chiffon. You can see the red chiffon is on top of the 2 collar pieces there. They're all sewn together, 3 layers, and when you turn it right sides out, that extra chiffon layer is going to be in the middle, and it'll just give it a bit more stability and take away part of the sheenness of the collar without having to fuse interfacing. So this is an option for something like this. I mentioned interlining there as something extra. If you don't want to use interfacing, you can just put a 3rd layer of whatever you're trying to stabilize. In this case, I showed a collar. In this case, I just had a collar stand because I was sewing a mandarin collar, so that is the collar there. And having those 3 layers is okay. You don't need to fuse anything in there, and it will give that mandarin collar a little bit more stability without having to use interfacing. I did this technique with a long red duster I made a couple years ago. I love that, and I couldn't find it right now. I wanted to show it. Silk organza is nice. I have never in my life used silk organza. I just use the same fabric or the same type of fabric. In this case, I used just a plain red chiffon. Pinning this took a while. The fabric moves around. Then I get my needle with any thread, whatever, for basting, and I take my time and I go removing the pins and hand basting this on. So collars are really tattletale if the technique isn't good and if it's wonky. So if you take the time to baste the collar on, the finish will be so much more professional. See, you can see I've basted that on. It's really nice. And then I go off to my sewing machine. I do take care to make it really precise. Here, this bias tape has been hand basted on before sewing it down onto a hem. This could be for a neckline, arm side, anywhere where you're using bias tape. Always good idea to hand baste that first. So much easier to sew without pins sliding around this type of fabric. This is a casing that goes on a neckline. Elastic goes through there. You can see some bright colored basting done there to secure that. Also, sewing that is so much better without the pins there. This could be a hemband or a cuff. You can see there's also some hand basting stitches there that are just going to allow for precision and ease of sewing. About hand basting, what can I say? I think in 99% of the videos that I show on the channel, in the up close and so personal segment where you can actually see me sewing, you will always see bits and bobs here that are hand basted for any garment. Denim, linen, cotton, whatever. But for these, I will always, I wouldn't even think. Now, if you get to a stage where you feel that this type of fabric feels like any other fabric, which I sometimes am, I have used just pins in the past. You can see there that I've just got pins and I'm sewing away my collar onto my neckline without hand basting. I'm actually sewing over those horizontal pins. It's the only time I will actually do that. I do slow down to do that, make sure I'm not going to break my needle. Do not do that. It's not recommended best practice, but I have done it in the past. Usually when I hem chiffon, I will fold first and hand baste that down. It does fray a lot, it's hard. And then after hand basting it once, I'll fold it again. Very small folds, even smaller than 1/4 inch, I would say. And then I'm going to baste again, hand baste again. So I'll have 2 rows of hand basting before I sew with machine. And I think this is better than just serging and then folding up, because from the right side you would see that serged edge and it would look ugly. Okay, so I folded it twice. You can see 2 colors of basting thread, and now I can finally sew this on the machine. I showed you there how to do a hem with a double fold. The fabric I'm working with, this crinkle chiffon, is terrible. It just frays like no tomorrow, and I had to be really careful while I was folding up and everything. Sewing it turned out beautiful, but I haven't always done that. It depends on how sheer the fabric and how fine I want it to look. This is the Rhapsody dress, and this is a very fine fabric, very flowy. It's not as sheer as others, and in this case I have just serged and folded up and top stitched the hem. You can make the choice yourself depending on the fabric you have and how it looks. You saw that I did do a little practice to see if the serging looked nice, but for this specific top I was making with the purple fabric, I did do it nicely and folded up twice. Before any step, any type of neckline, back, front, whether it be a wrap top or just a round neckline, whichever one you're making, needs to be stay stitched as one of the first steps. You can see that one there has a stay stitch done, and that stay stitch always needs to be done within the seam allowance that you're going to use, either for a facing or bias tape or whatever you're going to use. And you use the normal stitch length that you're using to construct your garment. I mentioned stay stitching necklines, and that is a given, you know, for any garment really, but for these specifically, Sometimes in the instructions, if you look through, depending on what pattern you're making, you might not see that stay stitching is one of the steps that is a priority. It might come later down the track. But knowing what you know, just grab your necklines and stay stitch them, and then you can relax and keep going. Another alternative to stay stitching is using a strip of interfacing. I just cut them out myself, non-stretch interfacing of course, lightweight, about 3/8 wide. And I fuse that onto the edges of the neckline, and I've done that with this one. You can see the black there, but then you can't see it inside. This is a Vivace dolman that I made out of this beautiful chiffon fabric, and it had those areas there where I had to attach on this collar that overlaps. So for me it was really important to keep the length and to keep the shape of this, and that's why I went through all the hassle of actually keeping the shape there and fusing that on, and it turned out really well. And you know, you can do more advanced techniques with these fabrics as well. It's just about thinking a little bit, how do I keep this fabric intact without stretching out basically. If there's a particular area you want to try on, I would suggest limiting try-ons, just maybe do it once. I'm checking there for the depth of the neckline. You can see I have stay stitched it before to protect it, but I don't want to be pulling this on and off before I've actually finished this neckline. I don't want it to distort. Don't hang it on mannequins, leave it hanging on hangers while you're sewing. Just leave it on the table nice and calm while you're making it, especially before doing that neckline. I mentioned to manipulate the garment delicately. Don't try it on excessively. Don't be yanking it off your head. Just be really delicate with it. And you know, for some garments I make a muslin so that I don't have to try on and check for dart placement or anything, shoulders that it's gonna match and fit, you know. This is a Zamora blouse from Itch to Stitch. Has a lot of details, has a deep V neckline with a bow there. Pin tucks. I didn't make a muslin. I tried it on only once, and just careful handling, you know, not excessive handling, you know, like draping it over your body and trying it on 20 times. Try to make that try on that you do on yourself worth it. See everything you want to see, and then just delicately take it off and keep sewing. Once you're done with the garment and all the edges are finished, you don't have anything raw there, then you can put it on and take it off how many times you want. I've only brought you a few here to show you as examples, or else I would have to bring you my whole wardrobe. This is the Bond shirt from Itch to Stitch. You can see this one has a mandarin type collar there, and that's what you saw when I was hand basting it or hand basted before sewing it, and it's super neat. I'm very proud of it, and it's a beautiful blouse. These types of fabrics are beautiful for these types of sleeves that have pleats, bishop type sleeves. There are actually some styles that I would not sew with any other types of fabrics, and I always have that saying that anything works in chiffon. Usually a style you would not consider, if you make it with chiffon, it's gonna work. For example, in my case, I wouldn't be keen on really large boxy styles with gathers, and the Shishielo top has that feature. And it has this like big sleeve with lots of gathers there. It's a very dramatic lantern sleeve with a cuff. Very well made and designed. And the only fabric I would make a style like this with like puffy sleeves or whatever is chiffon. I would not make this in anything else. I just think it's just too voluminous and too bulky. And my shoulders are pretty standard. My shoulders are the same width as my hips. And I actually don't want details here because I don't need to balance out my shoulders with my hips. In a pear shape where the hips are much wider than the shoulders, then big details around here can help balance out the hips. But in my case, if I have just bulk here, I'm just gonna look wider on the top and then narrow at the bottom. And I don't want that look for myself, so chiffon there for the win. I can try styles that I like visually that are not gonna work for me in different fabrics, but with chiffon, yes. You can make bias tape out of chiffon. That's what I've done here as well, just made a short amount, and it goes to say that they are hand basted and all those things. But it is possible. Now, for making bias tape out of chiffon, it's the only time I will use starch spray to stabilize it. It's just a small thing, it'll work perfect. I have heard that people spray their entire fabric to make it super stiff. I don't do that. You don't need to do that. I find that it's just too extreme. in my opinion. Another common tip that you might see, and maybe you've used it, is put big pages of tissue paper between your fabrics to cut it out. And that sort of goes against what I said about cutting a single layer. If you cut out a single layer, you tape your fabric down to your surface, you'll be fine. You don't need to add a layer there. That's going to distort maybe the grain line. Your fabric could slide in there between the tissue and you can't see. You might end up with wonky. I myself wouldn't be doing it or like recommending it as something that is amazing, that's going to help you cut really well. I hope you give all these tips a go. More than 20 tips. I'm sure some of them will work for you. Have a go, have a practice. Take these projects slowly. There's no rush. And I hope you let me know that you've tried something with these fabrics, because the garments just are so beautiful, so delicate, so feminine. Very worth using these fabrics for any style, because anything is going to look amazing. Some styles that you might think are not for you, they're going to work in chiffon, I promise you. And about the garment I made with this, keep your eyes open because it's coming very soon. If you like this content, click on the like, subscribe to this channel for more practical sewing content, tap on the bell so you don't miss out when new videos go live. Happy sewing, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!